Next, Broadway teaches the country to sing and dance during the Roaring '20s.
Broadway becomes the popularizer of the new, the modern.
The Charleston, jazz, and the new American slang. It's all on Broadway, the American musical. This is the Shubert Theater on 44th Street, the home of the famous producers who helped to make the 1920s the most prodigious decade in Broadway history. In the Jazz Age, New York was the Syncopated City, and Broadway was the Big Apple, the goal of all ambition. You could see Al Jolson and the Marx Brothers on stage, and songwriters like the Gershwins and Rodgers and Hart created fascinating rhythms. Thanks to the power of the press and the arrival of radio and talking pictures, everyone in America could hear the seductive siren song of Broadway.
Goodbye. Don't cry. The little future train that takes me away from you. You don't know just how sad it makes me. Kiss me pretty and then how do it over again. Watch for the mail. I'll never fail. If you don't get a letter, then you know I'm in jail. Hey, hey, don't cry, Tootsie, don't cry. Kiss me, Tootsie, goodbye.
Broadway in the '20s was a showcase for the sweeping changes that transformed American culture. New York was the mecca of the Jazz Age, and Broadway was its glamorous shrine, a place where fame was first manufactured.
Goodbye, Tootsie, goodbye.
The 20s are a time of incredibly rapid change, really quick modernization. And this is the decade in which Broadway and the musical theater are in many ways at the height of their influence.
A tremendously rich, exciting time in the theater. You know, in 1927, you have 250 shows opening, 50 of them musicals, and you have over 20 million people going to the theater, probably more than double what we have today.
From 1920 to 1929, you were really sitting on a rainbow. Everything was lovely.
A new era on Broadway began on January the 16th, 1919, when the sale of alcohol was outlawed in New York.
The night before Prohibition is enacted in New York, people do run wild. They run around with bottles and baby carriages. You know, they are buying every last bottle that they possibly can to store. They really think the supply of liquor is going to run out. What developed instead was that New York really led the nation in the carelessness of its enforcement of Prohibition.
We have 3,200 speakeasies on Broadway. 3,200 speakeasies between 42nd and 55th Street.
5'2", eyes of blue, but oh, what those 5 foot should do. Has anybody seen my girl? Turned up nose, turned down hole.
This is a very creative period for language. You had passwords at speakeasies. Classes were now mingling, and they were mingling with the underworld because everybody was breaking the law.
Upstairs, boy. Watch that elevator. Make it stop. You stay here. Everybody, stay right here.
A time when the rules and the language are being questioned and rewritten is going to be a golden age of musical comedy.
It's a time of liberated sensibilities, a feeling that life is full of youth and vigor, and the music of the 1920s, jazz, really calls the beat of a new age. And the songs that are coming out of Broadway really are registering this kind of shift in the American sensibility.
If it's naughty to rouge your lips, shake your shoulders and twist your hips. Let a lady confess, I wanna be bad. If it's naughty to vamp the men, sleep each morning till after 10, then the answer is yes, I wanna be bad. This thing of being a goody is all very well. What can you do if you're loaded with plenty of health and vigor? When you're learning the lips are for, if it's naughty to ask for more, let a lady confess, I wanna be bad.
New York theater, particularly musical comedy, is really about the pace of change. And nothing was changing as fast as the American woman. Look at what the woman was wearing in 1914 and what she's wearing in 1922. Her hair's gone, her skirts are short. Her hips have disappeared. Her back is in view. She's smoking, she's drinking. She's kind of trashed the past en route to the party at the speakeasy. And what would attract theater and musical comedy more than something changing that fast?
While American women were enjoying new freedoms, the heroines of Broadway were coming into their own good fortune. Audiences fell in love with Cinderella stories, musical comedies in which the main character might be a dishwasher in Act 1, but marry the man of her dreams just before the final curtain.
Many of the musicals were about women. There was a show called Mary, there was a show called Irene, there was a show called Sally. And then someone said, let's do a show called Sally, Irene, and Mary. And there was a musical with that title. You had to have a girl's name or some reference to a girl in the show.
She was almost always Irish, a good-hearted poor orphan who used slangy banter to win the hand of her millionaire suitor. The living embodiment of the jazz-age Cinderella was a petite blonde beauty who looked sweet but could dance hot. Marilyn Miller.
Marilyn Miller could combine innocence with savvy. She could convey that feel of the big city, the sparkle of the star. She could be both sophisticated and a kind of rural archetype of the farm girl.
Born in Evansville, Indiana in 1898, Miller was raised in showbiz, billed as Mademoiselle Sugarlump in her parents' vaudeville act. As a teenager, she danced in the Schubert's Passing Show revues. And in 1918, she made it to the top when Ziegfeld featured her in his legendary Follies.
She does her hair all wrong. She isn't costumed properly. She has a sweet voice, but not much of it. And I've seen better dancing. But a delightful thing happens when she comes on stage. Billy Burke Ziegfeld.
In 1920, Florence Ziegfeld showcased his all-American Cinderella in a new show with music by Jerome Kern. By the time the curtain fell on Sally, their spunky heroine had become a Follies star, just as Marilyn Miller had in real life.
Every star on Broadway is a testament to pluck and luck and achievement and all the values that come with the package of the American dream.
Just think, tomorrow night I'm going to get a chance to dance in front of a real audience.
Our culture is a cultural optimism, and what the musical sells is optimism.
Sure, I'm glad.
Your dreams came true on Broadway. You go to a Broadway show and your dreams came true. You go back to Williamsburg or Bronzeville or the Bronx and your dreams don't come true.
A heart full of joy and gladness will always fight sadness and strife. There is no time in silver lining and try to find the sunny side of the line. There now. Don't you feel better?
Sally captured the willful optimism of the age. And Marilyn Miller became living proof that Broadway could turn a dancing Cinderella from Indiana into a national star. The 20s on Broadway was an age of wonderful nonsense. Audiences wanted to have a good time, and musical comedy did not rely on memorable stories. For 50 cents, you could get a ticket to see the zany antics of the Marx Brothers live.
Did someone call me Schnorrer?
He went into the jungles where all the monkeys throw nuts.
If I stay here, I'll go nuts. Say, don't you see there are ladies present? What do you think this is? Put that hat down, will you?
What do you do there? Get out. Let's go.
The idea of a musical was you have a funny story or a silly story or a star vehicle, something that shows off your stars, and you have a comedy scene, and then you have a song and or a dance number.
The quintessential show of the 1920s was the revue. The musical revues of that period were a representation of the pluralism of American life. They captured a little bit of everything.
They were not musicals the way we think of them today, where there's a story and actors playing characters. They were loosely structured revues that featured songs and also the stars.
It was really disgusting.
Oh, it's terrible.
I'm sorry that you had to see this.
That's all right.
Now stand clear and keep your eye on the ball.
Most of the shows were almost entirely frivolous little stories. A woman named Maud, and a man named Claude. And then you'd never hear from them again in the next skit, because the next skit Bert Lahr was in.
Well, what about it? What about it?
That's what you call 2 in 1. 2 in 1. It's a suit and an overcoat combined. You like a suit like this?
Oh, I like a blue serge with a white stripe.
With a white... Oh, with a stripe. With a stripe. Say what you want. There you go.
Wait a minute. You're trespassing.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, rockabye, your rockabye baby, with a Dixie melody. Mammy mine, your little rolling stone that rolled away. Mammy mine, your little rolling stone is home today. Better stay just to see your smiling face.
The biggest star of the Prohibition era was Al Jolson, a Jewish immigrant from Eastern Europe who began his career in minstrel shows.
Mammy mine.
He was the self-proclaimed world's greatest entertainer, and his blackface Mammy songs brought audiences to tears.
When you croon a little tune from the heart of Dixie. Hang that cradle, mammy mine, right on that Mason-Dixon line.
Here's this Lithuanian Jew from the shtetl singing about my homeland in Dixie and my lost mother. The homeland was a homeland of the mind, a place where my sadness would be healed. And he never would have done that in his own persona, but hiding behind the black mask, he could go there, and audiences were intensely moved.
Rock-a-bye, your rock-a-bye, baby, to a Dixie melody.
The Broadway musical came from a very, very complicated place. Even if the end product seems to be one of joy and optimism and the human spirit soaring, their birth started in dark, really peculiar, really interesting places.
It's very hard for us to understand blackface today as an institution. It seems so incredibly racist and demeaning and stereotypical. But I think there's another side to it that Jolson represents. For Jolson, I think blackface was never about belittling dark-skinned people. It was about liberating himself. Putting on blackface helped him express a depth, a vulnerability. And that's where his star power came from.
Give me what I cry for. You know you got friends, kisses that I die for. You know you made me love you. You made me love you. I didn't think to do it. I didn't think to do it. You made me want you. All the time you knew it. Just all the time you knew it. You made me happy sometimes.
Jolson was a really crazy, neurotic man. He was very defensive and very difficult in that kind of prima donna way.
He had become a star, and he defined what it meant to be a star, to act like a star, in such a way that there wasn't much room for anybody else up there but Al.
Al Jolson used to have to turn the faucets on in the sink when other people in his show were getting applause. That's insecurity.
Jolson stopped a show that he was in that wasn't going well and said, "Folks, I can tell you how this ends. How about if I just come out and sing my songs?" And you either took Jolson on his terms or you didn't take him at all.
California, here I come, right back where I started from, where bowers of flowers bloom in the spring.
I was never a great Jolson fan. I always thought he overacted and overplayed, but the audience was not in agreement with my opinion.
Open up that golden gate, California, here I come.
The proudest day of my life was when Shuffle Along opened. At the intermission, all these white people kept saying, "I would like to touch him, the man who wrote the music." At last, I'm a human being. U.B. Blake.
The invention or the creation of jazz by black artists sort of gave this country a language that it was searching for and gave it a rhythmic identity. And so it makes perfect sense that the composers would use this invented language and rhythm for the theater.
A jazz show like no other arrived on Broadway on May 23, 1921. Produced on a shoestring with borrowed costumes and second-hand sets, Shuffle Along featured a rich, rousing score by Noble Sissle and U.B. Blake.
Ladies and gentlemen, years ago I wrote a tune called I'm Just Wild About Harry. I'll play it for you. I'm just wild about Harry. Harry's wild about me. I don't know the words, so I'll play the melody.
James Hubert Blake was born in 1883 and raised in Baltimore by a devoutly religious mother and a hard-drinking father. As a youngster, Hubie first syncopated church hymns on an organ, and at 15 he had a regular job as a pianist in a bawdy house. After World War I, he and vocalist Noble Sissel developed a vaudeville act called the Dixie Duo. When Sissel and Blake joined forces with another vaudeville team, Miller and Lyles, Shuffle Along was born.
Great comedic talent, great songwriting, and they're introducing a kind of romantic quality about black performers that had never before been seen on stage. Forget being seen, hadn't been allowed. There's a ballad that's introduced in the show, Love Will Find a Way.
Love will find a way.
Love will find a way.
First time was a love song in a Negro show.
Isn't that the song that they said that they couldn't afford to have in a Negro show because the Negroes didn't have romance?
Romance, yeah.
I remember that very well.
Yeah.
Oh,
Play
yeah.
the chorus. I don't
that-
know the verse now.
Well, that's all right. Sing
Just
the chorus and I'll try to help you. Here? Oh, good.
Love will find a way.
Oh, I know it will, honey.
Though the skies are gray, love like ours.
This was profoundly risky, but it paid off. The song was a hit, and the precedent was set.
With Shuffle Along, there was still unquestionably a certain amount of minstrelsy still going on. But because it was created by black artists and performed by black artists, you saw the real juice, you saw the real spark. Not black performers performing white people's vision of black people. It must have been just an exhilarating thing.
Shuffle Along cracked open Broadway's doors to black talent. And for the first time, the orchestra seating in a Broadway theater included a section reserved for Negro patrons.
It is when the chorus and principals get going in the dances that the world seems a brighter place to live in. They wriggle and shimmy in a fashion to outdo a congress of eels. And they fling their limbs about without stopping to make sure that they are securely fastened on. New York Herald Tribune, May 24th, 1921.
Look out. Let him. Atta boy.
Shuffle Along was very popular. It was a very clever show, very fast-moving, lots of good dancing, of course. Ziegfeld had to pick that up, you know, because it was the talk of the town.
Ziegfeld is asking in the dancers and singers and performers from Shuffle Along to teach his own chorus girls.
Many, many people were influenced by Shuffle Along. Irving Berlin said he went back to see it many times, and there's no question that the Gershwins were influenced by it.
For nearly 2 years, it was always packed. Shuffle Along gave a scintillating send-off to that Negro vogue in Manhattan. It gave the proper push that spread to books, African sculpture, music, and dancing. Langston Hughes.
The unexpected hit inspired a spate of new black musicals, which in turn generated interest in Harlem nightclubs that featured a new generation of black entertainers.
Jungle, hit fly.
Harlem and Broadway are having a fine old time in the 20s. A lot of your top jazz performers, whether it's Fats Waller, Louis Armstrong, James P. Johnson, they are playing in Harlem nightclubs. They are also writing songs for Broadway revues and appearing in them.
There was this period in which, everybody was sleeping across borders and boundaries. There was this incredible cross-fertilization, cultural appropriation. It's like in the 20s, everybody had permission to visit each other's lands and see what they were doing.
Broadway's most contagious contribution to the jazz age came from a black show with a white producer, George White. Runnin' Wild brought flapping elbows and bumping knees to the entire country with a dance called the Charleston.
George White liked to think that he invented 1920s dance. He liked to think that he was the guy that said, I've got this great dance here it is, the Black Bottom, the Charleston. So many of the moves that were associated with the 20s. Whether he actually invented these dances, the fact was he put them before the public in a way that the same way that you couldn't get a tune out of your head, you couldn't get White's dances out of your feet. That was what he did.
George White was one of the great review men. He did the Scandals. And because he himself was a dancer, he respected terrific dancers, and he got a lot of wonderful dancers. And he hired an incredibly gifted young composer very early on in the series named George Gershwin. And George Gershwin really learned his craft, writing for the George White Scandals.
I'd like to write of the melting pot, of New York City itself. This would allow for many kinds of music, black and white, Eastern and Western, and would call for a style that should achieve out of this diversity an artistic unity. George Gershwin.
George Gershwin's childhood was the perfect preparation for capturing the rhythms of New York's melting pot. Born in Brooklyn in 1898, his parents were Russian immigrants who constantly moved about the city, living in 28 apartments in all. First trained on a piano purchased for his older brother Ira, George quit high school and found a job as a song plugger, demonstrating material on Tin Pan Alley.
He used to make $15 a week at Remix. In vaudeville days, that's where people went to Remix to hear the music, and they'd always say, go to the room that George was in with the upright piano, and he'd play for people who wanted to know how songs would sound.
You have him at the store plugging songs. It's a very American notion that somebody could come in and, like, test drive a car. They want to test drive a song. He got very good at improvising and selling the song. And he developed in his piano style, which became his writing style. He was a composer who wrote very much from what he was able to play. If you see Gershwin's piano rolls played, you can't believe it, because there seem to be 20 fingers flying in every direction. And he found in his fingers voicings and jazz sounds.
To move up in the world of Tin Pan Alley, George Gershwin went to see Irving Berlin. He knew, as everybody did, that Irving Berlin could not read music and could only play the piano in one key. And he needed someone who could listen to him play and then write the notes down. To audition for the job, George took one of Irving Berlin's songs, sat down at the piano, and played it dynamically. And Berlin said to George Gershwin, "Don't be my secretary, kid. Go out and write your own songs."
When Gershwin wasn't plugging tunes on Tin Pan Alley, he hung out in saloons and cabarets in Hell's Kitchen and Harlem, where black musicians were transforming ragtime into jazz.
James P. Johnson and Lucky Roberts told me of this very talented au fait piano player at Remix. He was good enough to learn some of those difficult tricks that only a few of us could master. U.B. Blake.
George Gershwin was a rehearsal pianist, accompanist to vaudeville people. He was writing songs for reviews for anyone who would take his songs and perform them. And he wrote a song. Al Jolson heard it at a party, and he liked the song so much, he recorded it in early 1920, and it was the most successful song in George Gershwin's whole life. He never had another song come close to the sales of Swanee.
Swanee, how I love you, my dear old Swanee. I'd give the world to be among the folks in DIX. I even know my mammy's waiting for me, praying for me down by the Swanee.
Writing music for 4 of the George White scandals and 7 Broadway shows throughout the 20s, George Gershwin filled Broadway with his own unique style of jazz music.
George Gershwin loomed above the crowd like an enormous spotlight. Melodies leaked from his fingertips. Innovative, beautiful, rhythmic.
We saw a Gershwin musical called Tiptoes with a girl named Queenie Smith. It was dazzling. The first musical I ever saw. It was unbelievable.
Sweet and Low Down is an amazing number, and it was visually something that people who saw never forgot. And he had people on the stage with trombones.
Gershwin's music was so infectious that when the cast played their trombones and stomped their feet, the audience stomped along as well. Tiptoes featured lyrics by George's older brother, Ira, who became known as the jeweler because of his ability to set words into musical phrases. Ira's first Broadway show with his brother was Lady Be Good in 1924, which starred Fred Astaire and his sister Adele. That show produced one of the Gershwins' most enduring hits, originally titled Syncopated City.
One of the most intricate, rhythmical songs that anybody had written for a Broadway musical. Poor Ira, when he heard George play the melody with very tricky, irregular rhythms, said, "George, how can I set words to that?" And his next thought was, "Still, it's a fascinating rhythm."
Fascinating rhythm, got me on the go. Fascinating rhythm, I'm all afraid of birds. What a mess you're making, the neighbors wanna know why I'm always shaking just like a flipper. Each morning I get up with the sun, start hopping, never stopping. By that time the work has been done. I know that once it didn't matter, but now you're doing wrong when you start to patter. I'm so unhappy. Won't you take a day off?
Fascinating Rhythm seemed to capture what George's music captured the energy of the jazz age, the feel of New York.
Fascinating rhythm, you gotta stop picking on me.
The rhythms of the Gershwin shows are jazz-like. When you think of George and Ira shows, you think of Coney Island hot dog stands, lights coming on in the twilight, of tap dancing chorus girls.
Fascinating rhythm, you got to stop picking on me.
I think George and Ira Gershwin are really the minstrels of the jazz age.
Broadway musicals and musical reviews are really integral to a kind of revolution that goes on in the American language in the 1920s. One humorist said that when we Americans get through with the English language, it's going to look like it's been run over by a musical comedy.
Another bride, another groom, the countryside is all in bloom. The flowers and trees, the birds and bees are making whoopee. The choir sings.
This is an era when Americans really become conscious of how wonderfully vibrant their language is.
He's lost his reason, 'cause it's the season for making whoopee.
And the language is being registered by songwriters, but also by journalists, so that Walter Winchell can take a term like whoopee, which is a code word for sex, and then a Broadway songwriter, Gus Kahn, can write a song for Eddie Kantor called Makin' Whoopee.
You'd better keep her. You'll find it's cheaper than making whoopee.
And you begin getting, particularly around Broadway, a new argot that is coming out. You're getting words like turkey, click, hit, fan. These wonderful words that are coming out of Broadway and then disseminated by radio and syndicated newspapers around the country.
Writing in a staccato style punctuated by dots and dashes, one newspaper columnist held sway as the Bard of Broadway, Walter Winchell. He turned the page into a stage.
Commence. You put on the nickel.
I want to talk to Walter Winchell of the Daily Mirror.
Speaking. What's on your alleged mind?
Out there in America, people heard about this racy land of jazz and dance and drinking and parties and sexy, beautiful people through Walter Winchell.
In today's column, what in the devil did you mean when you said one of the STEM's most prominent phonies went gay in a whoopee asylum the other morning and sacked 4 Chicago gorillas and then had to spend plenty on giggle waters to square themselves?
Well, that's Broadway slang. It's Broadway slang, and it means that one of the 4 flushers along the main stem went into a nightclub and got very intoxicated. And then he spoke out of turn to 4 tough guys from Chicago, and to keep from being taken for a ride, you had to spend a lot of money on a lot of laughing soup.
A lot of what?
A lot of fun milk.
I don't get you.
Oh, a lot of joy juice, a lot of dream syrup. You know, firewater, whiskey.
Oh.
Winchell's nicknames for Broadway celebrated all its various guises. The hardened artery, the big gulch, the grandest canyon, Baloney Boulevard, and most famously, the Big Apple.
It is the Big Apple, the goal of all ambition, the pot of gold at the end of a drab and somewhat colorless rainbow.
The moniker for Broadway soon became a symbol for the entire city.
Mr. Morley. This is Miss Merrill, the feature writer of the United Syndicate. Mr. Hart.
How do you do?
Mr. Rogers.
How do you do? How do you do?
She'd like to do a story with you.
Gentlemen, you're about to be interviewed.
Wait till I fix my tie.
Don't you like being interviewed?
Well, I don't mind, as long as you don't ask us which we write first, the words or the music.
I'm not going to ask you that. I think our readers will be more interested in knowing how you get the idea.
You tell her, Larry.
Oh, no, you tell her, Dick.
The composer Richard Rodgers was born in Upper Manhattan, raised in a middle-class Jewish family, and weaned on comic operas and the music of Jerome Kern. His partner, the lyricist Lorenz Hart, showed an early gift for poetry and delighted in the lyrics of the Gilbert and Sullivan operettas. Despite placing a song in a Broadway show in 1919, real success eluded them. Producers and music publishers alike rejected their work. But in 1925, they finally broke through.
What a beautiful, tough, hard-hearted town it is.
What? Oh, Manhattan.
Manhattan. Manhattan. We'll have Manhattan,
the Bronx and Staten Island too. It's lovely going through the zoo. It's very fancy on old Delancey Street, you know. The subway charms us so when balmy breezes...
No one was more surprised by the success of Manhattan than the lyricist Larry Hart. He had always assumed that witty, clever lyrics never became popular on Tin Pan Alley, and he had written in Manhattan one of the cleverest of all lyrics that had been written up to that point. We'll have Manhattan, the Bronx and Staten Island too, and tell me what street compares with Mott Street in July. Sweet pushcarts gently glide, ding by. It's very intricate the way it works with Rodgers' music.
The great big city's a wondrous toy, just made for a girl and boy. We'll turn Manhattan into an isle of joy.
It became an enormous hit around the country. And people then began, for the first time, to listen to the lyrics in American Broadway musicals the way they had always listened to them in Gilbert and Sullivan. It was a new age of lyrics in the Broadway musical.
In a show called Connecticut Yankee, Hart combined the old English world of King Arthur with the new American vernacular.
Thou swell, thou witty, thou sweet, thou grand, wouldst kiss me pretty, wouldst hold my hand, both mine eyes look you to what they do to me. Hear me holler, I choose a sweet lollapalooza in thee. I'd feel so rich in a heart for two rooms and kitchen, I'm sure would do. Give me just a plot of nut, a lot of land, and thou swell, thou witty, thou grand.
In 1927, the year Connecticut Yankee opened, the team of Rodgers and Hart had 4 shows on Broadway. Dick Rodgers was only 25 years old. Larry Hart, 32. They were part of a new generation of songwriters that was busy making Broadway the place to be.
Richard Rodgers once described to me opening nights. He and all his colleagues, all the other composers, would go to everybody's opening night. And Gershwin, for example, would come out with a wonderful new rhythm or a syncopation or something, and Rodgers would race right home and have to top it. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone read the same newspapers. Everybody read the same columns.
Miss Fanny Bright. Walter Winchell, famous Broadway columnist.
And once you were accepted on Broadway, either as a performer or a writer, or you created a show that was a hit, then you were ready for the whole world.
1927 was a giddy time for Broadway, for Wall Street, and for Main Street, USA. Americans had heroes with nicknames like the Sultan of Swat and Lucky Lindy. Women's skirts were the shortest of the decade, and the world was listening to Broadway tunes on the radio, on phonograph recordings, and in dance halls and nightclubs. Broadway celebrated the reckless exuberance of youth, flappers, fads, and the latest dance craze. The biggest hit that year was Good News, with a score by the trio De Silva, Brown, and Henderson. The first act dance number was known as the Varsity Drag.
Ira and George Gershwin heard from their own mother, "Why can't you write hits like De Silva, Brown, and Henderson?"
They were the stars of that period. Their shows ran longer than anyone else's. They're about good times, about people passing footballs and winning girls, about guys sinking a putt. It's the optimism of Broadway.
Good News was one of over 50 musicals that opened in 1927, a year in which 8 new Broadway theaters were constructed. In one record night that season, 11 productions opened, and the following night, Showboat premiered at the Ziegfeld. The Broadway musical would never again hit such heights.
Wait a minute, wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet. You ain't heard a thing.
Now, and Al Jolson himself.
On October the 6th, 1927, the world of showbiz turned out for another opening night celebration.
Ah, boy, Al.
The star of the show at the Warner's Theatre on Broadway was Al Jolson. But he wasn't on stage in The Jazz Singer. He was on screen. It was something new, a talking picture.
Blue sky, smiling at me, nothing but blue sky do I see.
There had been shorts made of people singing before, but what really thrilled people in The Jazz Singer was when he's playing a song for his mother in her apartment at the piano, and finishes the song and then turns around and just starts to talk to her.
Nothing but blue skies from now on. You like that, Mama? I'm glad of it.
That's when the talkies were born, out of that star performer, reaching out to the audience, even from a film.
Bluebird, singing a song. Nothing but little bluebird all day long. I never saw the sun shining so bright, never saw things going so right. Noticing the day hurrying by, when you're in love, oh, don't they fly? Blue days, they say, all of them gone. Nothing but blue skies from now on.
The success of The Jazz Singer was the first blow of a mighty 1-2 combination that would send Broadway reeling. The crash of the stock market in October of 1929 put an end to Broadway's feverish expansion. The collapse of Wall Street was best captured in the slang used to describe an act that flops.
No joy on sale. Broadway, kicked, heeled, punched, and gouged by Wall Street, came within an inch of its nightlife last week, shattering all records for gloom in the country. The bottom dropped out of hilarity. Variety.
The biggest producer on Broadway, Florenz Ziegfeld, was hit the hardest. When the stock market began its alarming plunge, he was testifying in court, unhappy over a $1,600 bill for a marquee sign. By the time Ziegfeld left the courthouse, Broadway's greatest showman had lost almost $3 million.
I had never seen Flo like this before. I pulled his head down and took him into my arms. Well, poor old darling, what is it? Flo sobbed. They were great, struggling sobs. "I'm through," he said. "Nothing can save me." Billy Burke Ziegfeld.
After the stock market collapsed, the slow trickle of Broadway talent to Hollywood became a flood.
Everybody came out to get a Hollywood salary. The Gershwins used to have a show every season, sometimes two. But suddenly that dried up. You couldn't get the financing. And they came out to Hollywood. And they started writing pictures.
The Gershwins, Rodgers and Hart, Marilyn Miller, Florence Ziegfeld, Fred Astaire. Besides adapting Broadway hits, Hollywood created flimsy backstage stories around the production of a musical comedy or revue.
The films may have been made in Hollywood, but the subject matter has always dealt with New York City, because New York was the center of America. And of course, it was natural that Hollywood would be attracted to the world, the mythology of Broadway. And there was Broadway Hoofer and Broadway Through a Keyhole, and just 100 movies made in the first, let's say, 5 years of talking pictures incorporating the word Broadway.
That's it. The chorus in F sharp. There may be streets that have their sorrow.
The first talking picture to win an Academy Award, for example, was the Broadway Melody.
But there's a street that lives in glory.
The world of Broadway became the world of American entertainment.
Old story. Don't bring a frown to old Broadway. You've got a clown on Broadway. Your troubles there are out of style, but Broadway don't wait where to smile. A million lights, they flicker there. A million hearts beat quicker there. No skies are gray on the great white way. That's the Broadway melody.
Oh, Queenie, New York, the place we've dreamed and talked about. And it's swell. Yeah.
Roy, it'll be better for all of us if we stick in vaudeville.
What are you talking about, Joe? This is the greatest break we've ever had.
Tonight tells the tale. Broadway or bust.
That's the Broadway melody. Hot dog.
Broadway was the magic word. Anything could happen in New York. That was it.
Your future's in it, my future, and everything all of us have is staked on you. All right, now I'm through. But you keep your feet on the ground and your head on those shoulders of yours and go out and Sawyer. You're going out a youngster, but you've got to come back a star.
Oh, there she is now.
That's the Hollywood myth about Broadway, and it's the Broadway myth about itself.
Where the underworld can meet the elite. Naughty, gaudy, bawdy, sporty, bawdy,
By the end of Prohibition in 1933, Hollywood was producing a second wave of movie musicals, while Broadway was struggling with a deepening depression. But if Hollywood offered what George Gershwin called a Western tan and a pocket full of money, Broadway promised something else: creative freedom. In the Depression era, that freedom would inspire songwriters like Cole Porter, Rodgers and Hart, and the Gershwins to produce their greatest works.
It's the rhapsody of laughter and tears. Naughty, bawdy, gaudy, sporty, 42nd Street.
Her dances every ball there. Have been a thousand raggy prances that are pranced at every hall, but the best is the one that was. Give ball to ball some more buzz now, buzz. You think you baby stand and hold her man? You lay your head upon her shoulder next. You walk just like your legs are breaking, do a bangle like a tangle, then you start